To bully. I'm not suggesting we're the victims here, Mr. President, but I want to make it clear to these people. One of our colleagues and his family were effectively run out of a restaurant in recent days by these people. Them at the airports or going to their homes. Another reported having protesters physically blocked. There's no chance in the world they're going to scare us out of doing our duty. I don't care how many members they chase, how many people they harass here in the halls. I want to make one thing perfectly clear. We will not be intimidated by these people. This is all part of the organized effort to delay, obstruct, and intimidate, including those of us who will be voting this week. A few days ago, I did something I rarely do. I offered a prediction. I predicted that here, in the last few days before the Senate will vote on Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation, this is all part of the organized effort. The Democratic Conference would continue to make good on their leader's promise and fight this nomination with everything they've got. I predicted that on a dime. The very supplemental background investigation for which my Democratic friends had clamored, Mr. President, would suddenly become insufficient. Suddenly become insufficient. That no matter what accommodations were made, no matter what agreements were reached, Senate Democrats would find more excuse to continue moving the goalpost one more time. Now, granted, this wasn't exactly a radical prediction. This body and this nation have spent months watching their friends across the aisle grasp at every imaginable excuse to delay this process and damage this nominee. So I felt pretty safe in saying the last goalpost would soon be on the move yet again. But even I wasn't sure it would happen this quickly, Mr. President. Let's start with the Democratic leader and the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. In a letter released on September the 23rd, they suggested that the FBI had ample time to conduct a supplemental investigation before the hearing that was scheduled just 4 days later. They insisted an inquiry would, quote, not take a tremendous amount of time. Democratic leader brushed aside the notion that this, the seventh background investigation of Judge Kavanaugh, would delay the process, saying, quote, it'll only take a few days, said the Democratic leader. It'll only take a few days. Well, that was, of course, before we agreed last Friday to delay proceedings no more than 1 week to accommodate just such an inquiry. So, naturally, we're now hearing a different tune. Yesterday, the ranking member stated her view that voting this Friday on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination as planned would be, I quote, too soon. Too soon. There go those goalposts again, Mr. President, moving right on down. In that same letter, the Democratic leader and the senior senator from California called for this supplemental investigation because, quote, conducting background investigations on nominees has long been the FBI's standard practice. Standard practice. Here's what standard practice means. The FBI conducts interviews, prepares a careful report, and makes it available for senators to review. Standard practice does not mean what the Democratic leader decided to demand for the first time yesterday, now that the FBI is concluding its review. You get the picture. As they conclude the review, it's not enough. That we have yet another delay so FBI agents are made to appear, listen to this, Mr. President, for in-person briefings. And Democrats can cross-examine the agents to see if they're satisfied with how they did their job. Anybody surprised about this? There go those goalposts again. Well, guess what? Our Democratic colleagues have made it abundantly clear they will never, ever be satisfied. Not ever. Does anyone really think the same people who said any nominee of this president would result in the destruction of the Constitution will be satisfied? Does anyone really think the same people who called Judge Kavanaugh evil long before they heard one word of testimony from anyone is going to be satisfied? Does anyone really think that the same people who said their goal is to delay this nomination past the election are going to be satisfied? To ask the question is to answer it. So, if my friends across the aisle had their way, the goalpost on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination would be in another time zone. Another time zone by now. Our Democrat colleagues are quickly running out of material. One of their last efforts seems to be the new argument that, notwithstanding whether or not these allegations can be corroborated in any way, the real crime here is that Judge Kavanaugh stood up for his family and took umbrage at this disgraceful spectacle. He's now expected to witness this disgraceful spectacle and not get upset about it. I would ask any of my colleagues, how would you feel if your entire reputation had been destroyed in this mudslide, and be calm about it? For weeks now, the national media feeding frenzy has literally dragged Judge Kavanaugh and his family through the mud. He's been subjected to the most vile and disgusting accusations. His wife has been threatened. His young daughter's traumatized. In many instances, my Democratic colleagues have ushered on these absurdly disgusting accusations and tried to give them a veneer of credibility, specifically citing them now as a reason why Judge Kavanaugh should not be confirmed. Our Democratic colleagues are enabling this mudslide and encouraging it. And now the same Democratic senators have the temerity, Mr. President, to say Judge Kavanaugh disqualified himself for the Supreme Court because he got a little testy at the hearing. A little testy at the hearing after they drug him through the mud because he told them how much damage these accusations have caused him and his family. Let's get one thing straight right now. I don't want to meet the man or woman who wouldn't be frustrated and angered by a coordinated strategy to destroy their good name on the altar of partisan politics. The Senate has received an incredible volume of testimony about Judge Kavanaugh's exemplary judicial temperament. We've heard from faculty of his alma mater who called him a fair-minded jurist who believes in the rule of law and commands wide and deep respect among his legal peers. And from his former law clerks who say, quote, he listens carefully to the views of his colleagues and clerks, even indeed especially when they differ from his own. Yet some still prioritize partisan point scoring ahead of Judge Kavanaugh's actual record. We've heard overwhelming testimony that Judge Kavanaugh's time on the federal bench has been defined by equanimity, even-handedness, and fair treatment of all parties. Mr. President, it's time to put this embarrassing spectacle behind us. The American people are sick of the display that's been put on here in the United States Senate in the guise of a confirmation process. The FBI is finishing up a supplemental background investigation. It will soon add this information to Judge Kavanaugh's file for Senators' consideration. This, Mr. President, is the standard practice. Then, pursuant to last week's agreement of a delay no longer than 1 week, the Senate will vote on this nomination this week. The Senate will vote on this nomination this week. When we do, we'll be voting on one of the most impressive, most stunningly qualified Supreme Court nominees in our nation's history. We'll be voting to confirm a new Supreme Court justice who possesses sterling academic credentials, widely acknowledged legal brilliance, an exemplary judicial temperament, and a proven commitment to complete fairness on the bench. That is exactly what the Senate will do this week. Now, on a completely different matter, Mr. President, the Senate is also attending to other matters of critical nationwide importance this week. Today, we'll pass a fulsome reauthorization for the critical functions of the Federal Aviation Administration. We'll also take up and pass landmark opioids legislation. It's set to deliver major relief to American communities that have been decimated by the scourge of substance abuse and addiction. Every one of our colleagues represents families who've grappled with the loss of livelihoods and loved ones at the hands of this crisis, and nearly every one of them has contributed provisions to make this a truly comprehensive response. The legislation before us is the collaborative product of contributions from 70-plus members of this body. 5 different committees had a say. The result is a landmark package that will deliver critical resources to establish opioid-specific recovery centers and equip local medical practitioners. It will help law enforcement stop the flow of opioids across borders and increase safeguards against overprescription. So I hope each of my colleagues will join me in voting to pass this landmark legislation. I hope they'll join in getting more assistance, more tools, and more training in the hands of first responders. More access to housing and work opportunities for those in recovery, thanks to my Career Act, which I'm proud to say is included in this legislation, and more resources for state, local, and community leaders as they stand up treatment and recovery programs. So with today's vote, the Senate will say this to every American affected by the opioid epidemic: America is fighting back against this crisis. More help is on the way. Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that following disposition of the House message to accompany H.R. 302, the Majority Leader or his designee be recognized to make a motion to concur in the House message to accompany H.R. 6, and that notwithstanding the previous order in relation to H.R. 6, the Senate vote on the motion to concur without further intervening action or debate at 3:15 today, all as if in legislative session.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
The Democratic Leader.
Mr. President, first, I'm glad that the Majority Leader and I get along. I'm glad we're able to do certain things together, like the opioid bill and the appropriations bill. But that cannot hold me back from responding to the blatant falsehoods he tells day after day after day on this floor. First, from the man who single-handedly delayed the filling of Justice Scalia's seat for 10 months to complain about a 1-week delay to get the truth? Give me a break. It is classic diversionary, blame the other person tactics when he himself is the master of delay. It is galling, appalling to hear day after day the Majority Leader get on his high horse about delay when he almost invented the word when it comes to judicial nominations. Second, he blames Democrats for the delay, which is about the most blatant falsehood I have heard uttered on this floor in a long time. The majority leader knows darn well that he has the sole power to determine when to put the Kavanaugh nomination on the floor. He could have done it 2 weeks ago. He could have done it last week. He's now insisting he'll do it this week. Democrats have no say. He talked about an agreement that caused a week delay. Who was the agreement with? 3 Republican senators. The majority leader knows that it was Republicans who caused him to delay, both for the FBI investigation and for Judge Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford to testify. He didn't have to do that. He had the power. He's to blame for the delay, but he couldn't do anything otherwise because his own Republicans insisted on it. Again, it is a blatant falsehood. I'm so tempted to use the L word, but he's my friend, to say that Democrats caused the delay. Mr. Leader, assert your power to determine what's put on the floor and be a man up and say it's your decision, not ours. We have nothing to do with it. And third, he says one of the most qualified nominees we've ever seen. We know what's going on here. Everyone, including the majority leader himself, knows that Kavanaugh is a deeply flawed candidate for a whole lot of reasons. Knowing that, the majority leader and the Republican majority have to divert attention from Kavanaugh. So they're focusing on people who did nothing wrong, like Senator Feinstein, like Judiciary Democratic minority, like the Democratic Party. It's outrageous. But they know that Kavanaugh is not very good, and they know his testimony hurt him across America. I was talking to a CEO, a Republican of a major company, said his board was happening to watch the debate, and every one of them changed their mind after seeing Kavanaugh testify. They said, this guy doesn't belong on the bench. We can do better. That's the overwhelming reaction of Americans. Judge Kavanaugh hurt himself dramatically, permanently, by his screed, his nasty partisan screed. That's something of a new, unschooled, two-bit politician, not someone who wants to be on the Supreme Court of the United States. And he hurt himself. Leader McConnell knows that. The Republican leadership knows it. Donald Trump knows it. But they have to get the focus off Kavanaugh. And so they come up with these straw men and women. They come up with these false innuendos, distortions, and dishonesty. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Now let me turn to the president. And let me condemn, in the strongest possible terms, the comments by President Trump last night about Dr. Ford. President Trump's outright mockery of a sexual assault survivor, riddled as it was with falsehoods. Let me say that again. President Trump's outright mockery of a sexual assault survivor, riddled as it was with falsehoods, was reprehensible, beneath the office of the presidency and beneath common decency from one person to another. President Trump owes Dr. Ford an immediate apology. For too long, far too long, survivors of sexual assault have been afraid to come forward because they thought that powerful men would shout them down, and destroy their character. The President of the United States, the most powerful man there is, confirmed those fears for millions of women in the most despicable way possible. President Trump should send a message to the women of America right now that he's sorry for saying what he said about Dr. Blasey Ford, that survivors of sexual assault should not only be heard, but treated with dignity and respect and compassion. You don't have to believe everything Dr. Ford said, and I do, to refrain from the nasty, vicious attacks riddled with lies in sort of a mobocracy type way. And yet, Donald Trump shows no restraint, no regulator. He is the prime example of why the norms in America, regardless of politics, regardless of party, are declining. And we don't hear a peep out of my colleagues on the other side, with a few notable and noble exceptions. He's ruining the norms of America. He's so degrading the way people treat each other. It's pathetic. And it does permanent damage to this republic unless his own party members or others close to him speak up. Anyone who watched Dr. Blasey Ford saw a credible, courageous woman who elected to relieve the worst night of her life because she felt a civic duty to come forward. That action took immense courage. She's not the first. This is not unusual anymore. We know thousands of women who were hurt and then afraid to come forward, mainly because they thought they would be ridiculed, disbelieved, just as President Trump appallingly and despicably, lowly, did last night. Dr. Ford's actions took courage from a woman who admitted, she's far more honest than Donald Trump, who admitted that she was terrified to speak in public about her very private pain and trauma. I've been disappointed by President Trump's comments before, but this is a new low. President Trump should apologize immediately, I repeat that. And now, what will my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do? Ignore President Trump's comments, sidestep President Trump's comments, spend their time blaming Democrats, even though we had no say in the delay? That was 3 Republicans. We know what they'll do. It's shameful. The president is, day by day, tearing down the norms that have built this country up. We've had the greatest norms, the greatest character, the greatest behavior of any nation ever. But it's declining now because people of goodwill allow Trump to do it without criticizing him. And it's about time they did. It's about time they did. Now, shifting focus back to events here in Congress. We have to get back to reality and truth and focus on treating the Supreme Court nomination debate the right way. When all is said and done, this is about the nominee's credibility and temperament. I've said it before, I say it again. There are many who say what happened when someone was 15 and 18 doesn't indicate their personality and what kind of person they are when they are 53. Well, I believe Dr. Ford, and I believe what she said is very relevant. There are many who don't want to consider that. But there's an issue that should matter even to them, and that is the credibility and temperament of Judge Kavanaugh. This is what he is at 53. If he can't tell the truth about previous encounters, engagements, behavior, and activity, which we have found over and over and over again with Judge Kavanaugh, he doesn't deserve to be on the bench. That's why we need an FBI investigation. That's why Republicans stymied Leader McConnell in his headlong rush to have a vote and demanded an FBI investigation. It wasn't Democrats, we know that. Because they wanted to get to the truth. Because credibility of a justice on the Supreme Court is a very, very important characteristic. And right below it is temperament and lack of partisanship. And unfortunately, at least from initial indications, Judge Kavanaugh is not high on any of those 3 lists. That's why we need the investigation, and that's why we need it thorough. We need it to be thorough. But we still don't know how thorough of an investigation the FBI is conducting. As of last night, Dr. Blasey Ford and her list of corroborating witnesses have not been interviewed. While Deborah Ramirez has reportedly been interviewed, her attorney says a list of corroborating witnesses have not. NBC News is reporting that more than 40 people with potential information for the investigation have not been contacted for interviews by the FBI. I've heard the story over and over again. People call the tips line, that's what they're supposed to do, and they don't get a call back. This may be vital information. We want to know the truth. It can all be done in a week. The week that Senator Flake and Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski asked for, not that Democrats asked for, although we certainly agree with it. But that's not what caused Leader McConnell to delay, and every Republican senator knows it. So that's why we need this to be a thorough investigation. Without a clear sense of what the White House has told the FBI to look at in this investigation, we have no idea if the FBI is doing a real investigation or simply preparing a fig leaf at the direction of the White House for Republicans to vote yes. I understand the difficulty of the FBI. I have a great deal of respect for Director Wray. He's been pushed around. They've been ridiculed by the president, brave men and women who risk their lives for us, are part of law enforcement. But the FBI has a duty to do, and Director Wray has a duty to the reputation. And if he's being constrained by the White House, he has an obligation to let us know. And certainly, Counsel McGahn has an obligation to let us know what constraints he has placed upon the FBI. So here's what needs to happen. First, the White House must publicly release in writing what the White House counsel has instructed the FBI to pursue. If the FBI is not interviewing these witnesses that Ms. Ramirez's attorney presented to them because Counsel McGahn or Donald Trump has said don't do it, we ought to know that. And certainly not just we ought to know that, the senators who requested the FBI investigation ought to know that. Second, Leader McConnell should arrange an all-senators briefing from the agent in charge of the investigation before the vote. We should know what he did and what he didn't do and why. And third, the findings of the FBI investigation upon completion should be released publicly, with any personal information redacted. This is not the usual practice, but it's been done in the past when it's needed, and it's sure needed now. The FBI should do it. These three steps would go a long way to ensure the public's faith that the investigation has been conducted fairly, fully, and properly. This debate, this nomination, Mr. President, is about whether Judge Brett Kavanaugh has the character, the credibility, the impartiality to serve on the nation's highest court. In order to be an effective judge at any level, you need to be impartial, you need to be dispassionate. We don't ask our judges to be perfectly neutral, but we can't tolerate judges who are nakedly partisan either. Judge Kavanaugh himself has said that most obviously a judge cannot be a political partisan. Those are his words, but that's just what he has shown us he is in his long history and now in his recent rant. The testimony Judge Kavanaugh prepared for the judiciary last Thursday, prepared testimony. This was not just on the spur. This showed who he was. And it was steeped in partisan resentment and acrimony. He tried to implicate sitting senators in a calculated and orchestrated political hit job. That's what he said to the senators he was interviewing. He was being interviewed by. He denounced left-wing opposition groups who don't have close to the power the hard right has had in pushing our Republican colleagues around to rush this nomination through. But we don't hear about them. And then, topping it off, he portrayed the recent allegations against him as revenge on behalf of the Clintons. I dare say that Dr. Ford didn't have the Clintons on her mind once when she wrestled and struggled with whether to come forward. It's an absurd charge. Absurd. He even told Democratic senators, what goes around comes around, which to many ears sounds just like a threat. A judge telling people what comes around goes around? What goes around comes around? A judge, a Supreme Court justice says that when he's nominated? We can certainly do better. Even if someone is with the same ideology as Kavanaugh is chosen, someone who doesn't do things like that should be before us. And I hope that person won't be chosen, of course, if he has Judge Kavanaugh's ideology, which is why one of the main reasons I was against him to begin with. And we should never forget. It's likely Judge Kavanaugh will greatly impede or eliminate a woman's right to choose. It's likely, or it's very likely, he will get rid of health care, including pre-existing conditions. It's likely he'll allow presidential overreach. Those three substantive bases motivated most of us to come out against Kavanaugh even before his awful testimony. I understand Judge Kavanaugh felt his character was under assault. I understand he's feeling angry and upset. I understand responding to questions in the heat of the moment with words you might later regret. But these were prepared remarks. It takes a partisan to see a partisan conspiracy against him. As a conservative fellow at the Brookings Institute, former Kavanaugh defender Benjamin Wittes wrote in a column entitled, "I know Brett Kavanaugh, but I won't confirm him." Judge Kavanaugh's opening statement was an unprecedentedly partisan outburst of emotion from a would-be judge. I do not begrudge him the emotion, even the anger, but I cannot condone the partisanship, which was raw, undisguised, naked, conspiratorial from somebody who asks for public faith as a dispassionate and impartial judicial actor. His performance was wholly inconsistent with the Congress we should expect from a member of the judiciary. That's from somebody who's a conservative and a Kavanaugh supporter. The courage that a good number of both Kavanaugh's friends and observers like Wittes are showing in realizing that this guy's too much. I wish we saw a little more of that from the Republican side, because they know deep in their hearts this guy shouldn't be on the bench. We know they know. Now, the judge's partisanship at a hearing raises questions, as I've mentioned. But the biggest issue against Judge Kavanaugh, in my judgment, is credibility. The number one issue. Does Kavanaugh always tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Whatever you think of what he did as a 17 or 18-year-old, what Judge Kavanaugh has said as a 53-year-old matters. Whether you think the 17 or 18-year-old behavior should be part of the decision, which I do, or whether you don't. The harsh fact of the matter is that Judge Kavanaugh has repeatedly danced around the truth on issues large and small. In 2004, his first confirmation hearings. 2006, his second, and now again in 2018. On things like what happened when he did in high school and college and law school, to things like grand jury proceedings and White House controversies. Again, he has danced around the truth and never been direct and often tried to mislead. We cannot have a Supreme Court justice whose credibility is in doubt. That will hurt the nation for a generation. So I ask my colleagues, whatever you think about what Judge Kavanaugh did at 17 or 18, think about what he said at age 53. Think about the credibility of the man now as a grown adult and a judge. Think about whether we want to put someone who has been so partisan with questionable credibility on the court, or whether there is someone better. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. The clerk will report the unfinished business.
House message to accompany H.R. 302, an act to provide protections for certain sports medicine professionals who provide certain medical services in a secondary state.
Mr. President.
Majority Whip.
Mr. President, I unfortunately don't have enough time right now to respond to everything the Democratic leader has said, but I do want to say this. The most accurate statement that the minority leader made is he was against Judge Kavanaugh from the start. No one should be confused about this being a search for the truth. This is about search and destroy. Now, I think the Senate conducted itself appropriately. The Judiciary Committee conducted itself appropriately in giving Dr. Ford a chance to tell her story. I've said all along, I want Dr. Ford to be treated just the same way my daughters or my wife or my mother would be treated under similar circumstances. And I think we met that standard. But we know that the goalposts continue to be moved by our colleagues. This idea that you can assassinate a man's character, resulting in threats against his family, ruin his reputation and his future, and expect him to be a human punching bag and not respond forcefully? It's incredible to me. This should be about a fair process, but a fair process means that the people who ultimately decide should have an open mind at the beginning. You wouldn't want to walk into a courtroom and talk to a jury or a judge where the jury had already made up their mind. You would want them to listen to the evidence. That's what a fundamentally fair process means. And it also means that if somebody's going to make an accusation against an individual for a crime, which is what has been alleged against Judge Kavanaugh, that they would have to come forward with more than just an allegation. They'd have to come forward with witnesses, proof, evidence. Because under our Constitution, people are presumed to be innocent of crimes unless proven guilty. They are accorded due process of law, a fair hearing, a fair process. And unfortunately, as a result of the mishandling of Dr. Ford's confidential letter to the ranking member, contrary to her wishes and without her consent leaked to the press, she has been thrust into this three-ring circus. She was not told by her lawyers that the Judiciary Committee had offered to send a bipartisan team of professional staff out to her home in California to interview her confidentially. Why would her lawyers not tell her that? Because they wanted this three-ring circus? They wanted, despite Dr. Ford's wishes, not to be thrust into the spotlight? They evidently thrust her into that spotlight, raising the question in my mind, who are they working for? Are they actually working, these lawyers working for Dr. Ford? Or do they have another agenda and another client in mind? Well, the idea that now this has all come down to what somebody wrote in their high school yearbook is beyond parody. I mean, you can't make stuff like this up. And the judge, we know the judge is belligerent because he threw ice allegedly on somebody in a bar in college. Of course, the reporter who wrote that had previously sent out a tweet demonstrating his bias against Judge Kavanaugh. But now it's accepted as fact. And man, we're going to defeat this man because he threw ice on somebody when he was in college. Or we're going to go through his college yearbook. You know, I wonder what every senator in this chamber's college yearbook says, or high school yearbook, I should say. I hope that's not the standard. The Senate is an institution that operates based on precedent. If this is the precedent for future nominees, woe be to us, because we won't be able to recruit the best and brightest people to come serve in the judiciary or be subjected to this inquisition of a confirmation process. Like I said, Mr. President, there's more I want to say responding to the Democratic leader's comments, which I couldn't disagree with more. He'd already made up his mind, and so this is now about trying to build a case against the nominee. The problem is there isn't any evidence. And so in its place, what he wants to do is presume the guilt because somebody said something in their their high school yearbook, they ought to be disqualified because they allegedly threw ice on somebody when they were in college. That's disqualifying. That's making this whole process a laughingstock. This is the opposite of the sort of fair and dignified process that we should be following. But now, at the request of many senators, the FBI is going to be reporting back to the Senate on their supplemental background investigation. Will that be enough to satisfy those who have said all we need is one more week in order to allow the FBI to question more witnesses? Well, we see now that they've moved on, that regardless of what happens with this supplemental background investigation, they won't be satisfied because they had their minds made up already, even before Dr. Ford's letter became public. This is an embarrassing, disgraceful way for the Senate to conduct itself. We do not honor ourselves or this institution by handling this nominee like this, and this nomination, and these witnesses, including Dr. Ford, like this. I don't know what it's going to take for us to change, but one thing can't happen is we can't let these despicable tactics and this strategy win. Because if they're able to destroy the reputation of a sitting judge based on such flimsy stuff, that means this same precedent will be applied to future nominees. And woe be to us. And what a terrible disservice, not only to the good men and women who want to serve in government, but also to the American people. The thing I hate most about Washington, D.C., and its insular culture is that some people don't just want to win the argument. Some people don't want to just win the election or win the vote. They want to destroy their opposition. Destroy them. That's why people are talking about, even if the judge is confirmed, well, maybe over in the House they'll start impeachment proceedings. One of the members of the Judiciary Committee said, if the judge is confirmed, it won't stop there. I'm not going to stop. What does that mean? We need to vote. We need to get the FBI report, and we need to vote. Because the longer this circus continues, the more embarrassing it becomes to the Senate and to the senators who work here.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, later today, we're going to have an opportunity to vote on the Opioid Crisis Response Act. And I want to take some time in complimenting all involved in bringing this legislation forward. First, let me start by acknowledging the problem in Maryland And the problem we have in Maryland is throughout our entire country. Recently, I was at the MedMark Treatment Center in Baltimore City, and I had a chance to see firsthand efforts being made by the local community, by private sector, and by government to deal with those who have addiction issues as a result of the opioid crisis. And I must tell you, they're making progress, but the problem continues. The problem continues in every community in Maryland. I've had similar roundtable discussions in Western Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, in the Baltimore and Washington metro areas, in all parts of Maryland. In every community, they tell me that the crisis of overdose is still increasing, despite efforts made by local communities to try to deal with the addiction issue on many fronts. On the front of law enforcement, on looking at different ways of dealing with pain medicines, and looking at ways to deal with people with addiction issues. But as we know, with the widespread use of addictive opioids, they hit the market. People became addicted to the opioid medicines through prescription medicines that were not used for its proper purpose. Later, they used heroin, which was cheaper than the opioid medicines. People became addicted to that, and more recently, heroin's been diced with fentanyl, which can be very deadly, much more powerful than heroin or opioids, and people end up in the emergency room. In many cases, they end up dead. Congress has responded. We passed the 21st Century Cures Act, which was a bipartisan bill that set up a framework with dealing with alternative ways of handling pain rather than using addictive opioids, and dealt with providing significant resources to local government to deal with the issues in law enforcement and in prevention and in dealing with people with addictions. And of course, the passage of the Affordable Care Act provided third-party reimbursement for people with behavioral health and addiction, which helped not only those that are in the exchanges on private insurance, but also those in the Medicaid system. So we've done a job in trying to respond to it. Now we have the legislation before us, the Opioid Crisis Response Act. I'm very pleased about the provisions. Many committees provided input. It's a true bipartisan product, reflecting the will of the House and the Senate and the different committees of jurisdiction. I'm particularly pleased that we have provided additional resources and flexibilities to local communities. But the one thing I learned in visiting the different parts of Maryland, that programs in some communities will work. In other communities, they assume programs won't work. So we need to look at what works for the community involved. So the legislation before us reauthorizes and improves the 21st Century Cures Act. In my state of Maryland, we received $20 million under that act in FY17. I've been encouraged by the governor and the mayor of Baltimore and other local officials to support that reauthorization and improvement. They know it will help them deal with the problems. Let me tell you what the additional flexibility means for people in Maryland. In both Baltimore City and the Upper Shore, the local governments are looking at establishing what's known as a stabilization center. Stabilization center is to take those who have OD issues out of the emergency room into an appropriate setting where they can get the help they need, the treatment they need for recovery. The problem in our emergency rooms is that many times these people that are OD'd, once they're brought back, can become very disruptive, and they can actually adversely affect the health care in the emergency room settings for other people that are there for other purposes. In addition, they can't always get the services they need, particularly in the middle of the night, to deal with their addiction problems. A stabilization center is set up to deal with those issues. The problem is there is no funding for stabilization centers. Fortunately, under this legislation, flexibility is given in regards to the grant program under the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, where local governments can apply for funds to deal with these innovative approaches to dealing with the addiction issue. I was pleased that that was a recommendation that I had made and that was incorporated into the final legislation. Another popular type of program in my communities is peer support. They find that people who have gone through this problem are much more effective in reaching out to those who have an addiction need today and can provide the type of support they need to stay with treatment. The problem, again, is that peer support is not reimbursed under our healthcare reimbursement structure, certainly not under the Medicaid system. So I was pleased that this legislation includes an amendment I offered that will get a GAO study as to how we can modify the Medicaid reimbursement system to deal with peer support services in our community. I am also pleased that we remove restrictions on medical reimbursement for inpatient substance use disorder. I worked with other members of the Senate to get that included in the final bill that we'll be voting on later today. We've also provided enhanced medication assisted treatment in the Medicare system. That is an issue that I came forward with in this legislation, and I'm pleased that it was included. The legislation also provides flexibilities for medical home health, which is an important way to deal with addiction issues. Telehealth, many of us have worked on the telehealth issues. That is also enhanced in the legislation before us. And we give additional flexibility for residential facilities, removing the caps on the number of beds, which can help us, again, deal with the needs in different communities around our nation. Bottom line is, I was pleased to work with colleagues on both sides of the aisle in order to provide the flexibility to local governments and local communities to do what they need in order to deal with this crisis, and at the same time provide the federal government partnership and resources that can really make a difference. We do more than just dealing with the treatment issues. We deal with law enforcement, and I'm pleased that's in the bill. Our governor had asked that we deal with the challenges of shipment through international mail of fentanyl that's coming into this country. That issue is dealt with in this legislation, and I was pleased to be part of that. I'm also pleased that we were providing first responders protective equipment to deal with fentanyl. Many of our first responders are being attacked through the fentanyl as they respond to an OD episode. And I'm pleased that there's help in this legislation to deal with that. I'm particularly proud about that since Smith Detection, which is located in my state, is providing the technology to help our first responders. Maryland has a high-intensity drug trafficking area designation. There's improvement in this bill to deal with the funding in that area, to deal with the current opioid crisis. Money's in this to deal with drug courts. All this will help the people of Maryland and across our nation. The legislation also deals with workforce, student loan forgiveness for those who go into this field. That's certainly something that is welcomed and needed. And lastly, Mr. President, the bill deals with housing. Housing is a significant challenge for those who have addiction needs. And this legislation will allow us to have innovative programs under Medicaid to deal with housing in conjunction with the opioid crisis. I'm proud that we were able to work together, the committees, both sides of the aisle, both chambers, and I look forward to the passage of this legislation later today. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
What should I do here?
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, what is the order right now? It's my understanding, I say to my good friend from Illinois, that I was to be speaking in alternating back and forth. Is that correct?
There is no order in effect.
All right. I ask,
the unfinished business is the House message to accompany H.R. 302.
All right, Mr. President, I ask that I be considered, be recognized for 10 minutes.
Mr. President, if the Senator from Oklahoma, I've been waiting for 10 minutes. I didn't realize that it was going to be an alternating situation, but I want to defer to his seniority and our friendship. I would just like to ask how long he will speak, and I would like to ask unanimous consent to follow him.
Let me ask my friend how long he would be if I defer to you at this point.
10 minutes.
All right, I'm going to defer to you for 10 minutes. I ask unanimous consent that at the conclusion of his remarks, I be recognized for such time as I shall consent.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it's hard to believe it was 3 weeks ago when we first heard the name Christine Blasey Ford. It seems like a lot longer, doesn't it? In that period of time, a lot of things have occurred. The first thing was an announcement from the White House that, and this came from Kellyanne Conway, she said that Dr. Ford's testimony and complaint would neither be ignored nor would she be insulted. Last night at a rally in Mississippi, the President of the United States mocked Christine Blasey Ford for her lack of specific memory about this terrible sexual assault which occurred 36 years ago. I think most people realize that she testified under oath, gave us all the information she knew, and conceded there were things she couldn't remember. Neither she nor any victim should be in any way belittled because they can't remember all the details of something that happened in the distant past and something that they would much rather forget. Let me also remind those who are following this debate, it was Dr. Ford who stepped forward and called for an FBI investigation. She was willing to step forward before the FBI and tell her story. It was Judge Kavanaugh who resisted it even when I asked him directly. Now the FBI investigation is underway. For the good of the Senate and for our nation, I hope that this is a complete, professional, nonpartisan investigation, and I hope that we're given the time to at least read the report from the FBI before the Republican majority leader in the Senate plows through, as he said over and over again, to a vote in this Senate. I would hope that those who come to this issue in good faith, regardless of their position, will be respectful of a process which we may be using in the future and should respect as it reaches its conclusion. On a separate issue, Mr. President, I'd like to tell the Senate about an experience which I had several months ago. I was in an immigration court in Chicago. Never been there before. It was in a high-rise office building in the Loop in Chicago. The corridors were packed with those waiting for an opportunity for a hearing. I went into this courtroom where a judge was sitting and saw the two people who were before the court that day to have their case heard. The judge called the courtroom to order. She was very respectful to the two individuals who were there, but she had a problem. One of the people before her could not get into the chair to sit down for the proceeding. And the reason that young girl, whom I'll call Maria, could not get into the chair was she's 2 years old. 2 years old. One of the volunteer attorneys lifted her up and put her in the chair and handed her a stuffed owl, which she clung to through the whole hearing. Now, the other person who was being subject to a hearing that day had no trouble getting into the chair. He scrambled into that chair and sat down because he was anxious to play with the Matchbox car that was on the table. This young man, whom I'll call Hamilton, was 4 years old. In the United States of America, in the city of Chicago, in an immigration court of this federal government, these two individuals were up for a hearing because they had been separated forcibly from their parents. There was no real conclusion to the hearing. They reset the next hearing date for these two children, 2 years old and 4 years old, for 4 days before Christmas. How did we get to this point in America where we're actually having a federal court hearing of an immigration court for a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old? One too small to even get into a chair by herself, and the other who, thank goodness, found a Matchbox car to play with during the proceeding. We reached this point because of the announcement of the Trump administration of something called zero tolerance and the decision to separate over 2,700 children from their parents at the border. Where are we today? We're in a situation where 136 of these children, months after this policy was started and then discontinued, 136 of these children are still being held by the government. 96 of them have parents who we believe to be outside the United States. Just this last week, the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General came out with a report, which I commend to everyone, analyzing what the zero tolerance policy meant. I'll tell you what it meant. It meant the absolute ultimate when it came to cruelty and incompetence. What they tell us in this report was a decision was made by the Trump administration and by the Department of Homeland Security under Secretary Nielsen to separate children from their parents even before these children had the ability to speak. They were called pre-verbal children, and they separated them without any plastic bracelets on their wrist, without any fingerprints to trace them back to their parents. They were separated not by blocks or even a few miles, but sometimes 1,000 miles. I came to learn the story of the little boy I call Hamilton because it was published in the New Yorker. It was a story about his mom from El Salvador and the little boy being taken from her in March. Taken from this mother. They left the mother in Texas in detention, and they transported the child to Chicago. Initially, a volunteer lawyer came in, bought a phone card, and said to the mother, "You can call him." And she did. And they would talk for a little while and sing a little song. The next time she called him, he wasn't as responsive. It has now reached the point where that 4-year-old little boy will not speak to his mother on the telephone, will not communicate with her. The people at the shelter in Chicago have begged the mother, "Tell him he has to eat." Did you ever see a little 4-year-old boy that you would have to tell you have to eat? It says something about his state of mind. Sadly, this 4-year-old is now reverted back to diapers and won't say a word to his mother on the phone. Separated by a zero-tolerance program of this Trump administration. Well, what they tell us from the Department of Homeland Security and Inspector General's office is we are far from the end of this sad, disgraceful chapter in American history. Who is going to be held accountable for this? Will it be the president, perhaps in some election in the future? Will it be the Attorney General who proudly announced this new program of separating mothers from children? Will it be the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security who separated these children, according to the Inspector General's report, putting them in confined spaces which were unacceptable by humane standards, which we've actually been governed by for years in the United States? I believe Secretary Nielsen should be held responsible. I believe she should resign. Someone has to answer for this disgraceful chapter in American history. And we still must remember 136 eligible children are still being held by our government under this policy. It is time for us to reunite these children with their parents. Except in the most extraordinary circumstances, it is time for us to try to put these families back together again. I want Hamilton to start eating again. I want him to be in his mother's arms again.
But allowing an individual
to try to get over this chapter in his young
United
life
States to Canada or
could
back
affect
and
him
forth
for as long as
with
he
a
lives.
small amount of
I yield
goods
the
they
floor.
purchased is significant to someone that's just going to be a normal consumer crossing back and forth across the border.
Mr. President,
to
amid all
finally
of
get that
this,
resolved, that's been a problem for a long time. And the
unfounded and uncorroborated accusation and attacks on a fine jurist, I think it's important for us to remember that other things are happening here at the same time. For one thing, I would only make one comment about the comments of the previous speaker, and that is that the program that was somewhat accurately described actually started in not the Trump administration, but the Obama administration. But what I want to say is that something really significant is about to happen. That is something we've been waiting for a long time. Now, if you're not on the Commerce Committee, you're not dealing with this issue, or actually the Public Works, there are 3 committees dealing with it, you wouldn't be aware of how significant the vote coming up really is. We're going to be voting to reauthorize the FAA. This is something we've been trying to do now for many years, and this is actually a 5-year reauthorization. That's significant. It's been, last time we did a 5-year reauthorization of the FAA was back in the 80s. And now it's a huge win, this thing is, for not just the obvious good things that are going on in what we need to be doing to update the system that we're working with, but if you single out general aviation, into pilots, it's really a big, major deal. The legislation needed investments in our national airport infrastructure, and it supports the general aviation community. It improves commercial service for the flying public and streamlines the FAA regulatory process, eliminating a lot of the red tape that goes along with any bureaucracy. It enhances aviation security and promotes responsible and safe integration for drones in our national airspace. Now, as an active pilot, I'm especially pleased that many pilot protections I fought for on this bill. In fact, I'm very proud that I actually introduced in committee and received and was able to get in the bill 6 of my amendments that I think are, in fact, I know are very significant, and they mostly address general aviation. It's going to have more transparency in communicating with the FAA. We've heard the stories about some of the FAA enforcement proceedings and how, and which is common to a lot of bureaucracies. It strengthens one area, the notice to airmen. That's called NOTAMs, N-O-T-A-M-S. NOTAMs are notifications to people who are pilots to let them know if they're going to land on a runway, if there's a problem on the runway, if it's under construction or something like that. And it came from a personal experience that I had when I landed on one that was under, that there was work on, but there are no NOTAMs, so there's no way of warning people. I remember so well, I said, well, where are the NOTAMs if you say there are NOTAMs? And they said, well, that's for you to find out. Well, this changes all that. So we have the NOTAM reform that's in there. It includes the Volunteer Pilot Protection Act. That's kind of like the Good Samaritan Act. I remember, about 30 years ago, I was mayor of Tulsa at that time, and they're on the island of Dominica, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic, was a radio conveyor that reached the entire Central America and a lot of South America, the Gospels over the programs, and it was wiped out by a hurricane. I remember getting 12 pilots together and 12 aircraft together and going down to take medical supplies, take food, and all these things down to that island. Actually had to fly through a hurricane to get down there. But there were 4 people that were going to go and did not go because they might incur some kind of liability. They might do something on the way that would create that problem. Well, the Good Samaritan law that we have that's are there in this bill is something we've been working on for a long period of time, and will allow people not to be punished for their generosity, which has been the case before. The bill directs the FAA to update regulations and policies related to this selection and training and designation of pilot examiners. Here's a big problem, and I experienced this personally just about 3 months ago. They're called DPE, Designated Pilot Examiners. There aren't enough of them around, and what we did with this bill was add a new form of inspecting pilots that's going to allow one examiner to do twice as many pilots. And that's something that is, here it is in this bill. Now, without the proper examiners, we don't get, the commercial pilots are prevented from obtaining the recurring qualification, then flight schools are prevented from graduating students. Because there is a problem right now in the problem of numbers of people who are out there who have passed and want to take examinations and are not able to do it. It also addresses the problem of contract towers. Now, contract towers, most of the towers that you see around the country, the largest ones, are called FAA towers. However, some of them are contract towers, so they are contracted with the private sector. Well, this is good. They do a good job. And I would just suggest, though, that if we had not allowed for these contract towers, we wouldn't have, in my state of Oklahoma, some 7 towers that are out that would be out there. Now, if 2 of those contract towers are in the cities of Stillwater and Norman, Oklahoma. Well, Stillwater happens to be the home of Oklahoma State University, Norman, Oklahoma University. Now, I suggest to you, Mr. Chairman, on game day, if you're in there going in with sometimes up to 1,000 aircraft, and if you didn't have a tower on there, how is that going to work? Well, that's a recognition that that's a problem that needs to be dealt with, and that's in this bill. And it also affects a lot of the airports that are adjacent to military bases. It updates the FAA's dated benefit process, ensuring communities invest resources in without just unnecessary paperwork. The FAA reauthorization unlocks the economic growth potential of aviation and provides to local communities. We had in Oklahoma, not far from Tulsa, actually, is a very small community called Bristow. And Bristow had two large industries who were wanting to move in there and were not able to do it, and were making a decision to go not just to another community in Oklahoma, but to another state. It wasn't as far as Alaska, but it was not too far away from Oklahoma. And so what we were able to do is leverage the state funding to put in the improvements to the airport. And I was there during the dedication, and those two very large industries are moving in. People don't realize what an airport means to a local community in rural America. And so this has provisions in there that will allow that to take place. Then the other one I just want to mention, if you're in a general aviation airport environment, now that's not like DFW or Dulles, one of those. It's the smaller ones. And in the chair's state of Alaska, that's about all they have up there. And if you are in that type of an environment, then you don't have if you get federal funds, and they all do get federal funds, then if they don't use that in a general aviation airport, it automatically, under current law, goes to DFW or one of the giant airports. And under this, it's going to guarantee it will go to another general aviation airport, which is a huge win. Well, our nation's aviation industry is facing a dire shortage of pilots. We have language in here that's going to be helpful. Now, we all know about the problems. Those of us particularly are serving on the Senate Armed Services Committee about the pilot shortage that we have. We have some 2,000 pilots right now. They're actually fighter pilots that are short. One of the problems is that during the 8 years of the Obama administration, in the process of starving the military, they were not allowing their pilots in the Navy and in the Air Force to fly more than 12 hours a month. And this was something that can't be done. And consequently, they were in that position of not being able to have them do it. Well, in this bill, we're starting out and actually have language as a pilot program to allow students in their high schools to go through ground school, to get people so that they are interested in aviation. All that is in this bill. The program's just a wide array of public and private sector stakeholders are dedicated to promoting aviation and an accessible future career path for pilots. So I applaud the FAA's the reforms in the FAA process and for certifying aircraft and aircraft products. One of the problems we've had is out there is that people who are building, and I'm talking about major builders or experimental builders, building aircraft and then not being able to get them certified because of the long process and certification. We have shortcutted that and have the same amount of requirements, but I've done it in this bill so that we'll be able to almost double the number of certifications. So that's happening right now, and I want to thank Senator Thune and Senator Nelson and the committee for acknowledging that we finally have to do it. For 10 years now, I've been sitting around waiting for a reauthorization bill and been talking to people and about what the consequences are. And now, finally, after about 30 years, we have a reauthorization bill that is a 5-year bill. We're going to be voting on it shortly. It's going to be a great improvement. And so other things are happening here. We are passing things. We are being productive, and we'll continue to do so as soon as this fiasco is over, the challenges to our fine Justice Kavanaugh. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, I stood here to commend this body for developing and passing much-needed legislation to help families and communities respond to the opioid overdose crisis. This crisis is a tragedy, a scourge, an epidemic that claimed an estimated 49,000 lives just last year. It is one that knows no political, territorial, or demographical boundaries. Soon, the Senate will consider a bipartisan, bicameral, consensus opioid package, which overwhelmingly passed the House of Representatives last week. Contained within the conference bill are several of my provisions from the Senate-passed legislation, including opioid milestones, a bipartisan bill I introduced with Senators Murkowski and Hassan to create a scorecard to measure our nation's response to the opioid crisis. In other words, as we spend more money, how do we now give a grade to each one of the programs that we're funding so that in 2, 3, 4 years, it's best practices across the whole country so that we're ensuring that we learn the lessons of what is in fact occurring. So that's a milestones bill, a scorecard, so that we know what is happening with the money, with the programs that we're funding. The final package also retains important legislation I introduced with Senators Young and Baldwin to help address increasing rates of infectious diseases associated with injection drug use like HIV and viral hepatitis. 2 weeks ago, while highlighting these provisions, I also called upon my House and Senate colleagues to include in the conference legislation a critical policy that was noticeably absent from the Senate-passed bill, expansion of medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, for opioid use disorders. In 2016, I worked with Senator Rand Paul to expand access to MAT by enabling nurse practitioners and physician assistants to temporarily prescribe Suboxone. And this year, I introduced bipartisan legislation with Senators Paul and Senator Collins and Senator Hassan to provide permanent MAT prescriber authority for nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Our legislation would also extend this authority to other nursing professions already stepping up to address the opioid crisis: certified nurse midwives, clinical nurse specialists, and certified registered nurse anesthetists. As this consensus legislation was being negotiated, Senator Paul and I led a bipartisan, bicameral letter urging leadership to include the House-passed version of our legislation in the final bill. Today, I am pleased to report that we succeeded in this endeavor. Section 3201 of the conference legislation would permanently allow nurse practitioners and physician assistants to prescribe MAT. It would also provide that authority to the other nursing professions for 5 years. This policy will immediately save lives and improve our overall response to the opioid overdose crisis. And I thank my partners in both the House and Senate for fighting to ensure that we reduce the demand side of this epidemic by enhancing access to treatment. In addition to expanding MAT, the conference package takes important steps to help connect vulnerable populations to health care, particularly substance use treatment. As we work to address our nation's opioid crisis and right the wrongs of the failed war on drugs, we must do all we can to remove barriers to care, including for those who have been incarcerated. Last month, I reintroduced my legislation, the Supporting Positive Outcomes After Release Act, which prohibits states from terminating an inmate's Medicaid coverage during incarceration. My legislation would instead require states to temporarily suspend Medicaid coverage, ensuring immediate access to health care services upon re-entry into the community. In other words, when the prisoner is left out of incarceration and they're back in the community, they have access to health care services. Otherwise, the likelihood of relapse is very high. And I am pleased in the conference opioid package, it includes a version of my legislation requiring states to suspend rather than terminate Medicaid coverage for young people under 21 years of age during incarceration. This provision will help bridge the precarious time after release by ensuring these individuals can access their benefits as soon as possible. So I applaud the work of Senators Hatch and Wyden to include this important provision in the conference package, and I hope that this is a step forward in expanding this suspension policy to other Medicaid populations. I don't think it should just be 21 and under. I think it should be anyone who is leaving prison. A high percentage of people who are in prison have some drug-related problem. And if we don't provide them with the treatment they need as they're leaving, then it's almost, if not a guarantee, just a high probability that they're going to take a U-turn and come right back with the same problem again. So this final opioids package represents a critical component of our response to the nation's opioid overdose crisis. I commend Senators Murray and Alexander on their incredible and tireless work to put this legislation together, and I thank them for working with me throughout the process on all of these provisions. However, this should not and will not be the end of Congress's efforts to tackle the opioid epidemic. There remain a number of other outstanding proposals like mandating prescriber education and clearly labeling the risk of opioids on prescription bottles that could pay big dividends in addressing this crisis. And I just say in conclusion that it's a missed opportunity when we don't mandate physician education across the whole country on the prescribing of opioids. We should do it. There's a lot of physicians out there who are prescribing bottles of opioids who have never had the correct training in order to ensure that they understand what the consequences are. And simultaneously, Senator Hatch and I have introduced legislation that says in the absence of mandatory physician education, that the bottle cap of every opioid have a warning as they're taking the bottle from the pharmacy, so that the mother, the wife, the father, the responsible party in the family can actually see that this is dangerous and it's addictive. And the warning is right on the bottle cap in a color, red, orange, green, that just says this is a different medicine that you've got in your cabinet than anything else. At least give to the mothers and fathers, at least give to the family members the tools they need in order, or the information they need to say, the physician didn't tell us this because they weren't mandated to have the education, but at least I can read it and say to myself that this is something I should be very careful with in allowing my family member to take these pills. That's for another day, but I think it's important, and I think it's something that we're going to have to include ultimately down the line, just to give families the information they need. So I thank, again, I thank everyone, Democrat and Republican. This is a perfect example of how bipartisanship prevails over paralysis, and there can't be a more important issue that we prove that this institution can work. So I thank everyone involved, and Mr. President, with that, I yield back to the chair.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to discuss the bipartisan bicameral 5-year reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration Act that we'll be voting on here and I believe passing in about 1/2 hour. This is the first 5-year reauthorization for the FAA since 1982, providing long-term certainty for our aviation infrastructure while ensuring that we continue to have the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. The bill continues to provide stable funding for the Airport Improvement Program, which supports construction, rehabilitation, and development of airports of all sizes, including the construction of the new Williston Basin International Airport in North Dakota, for the first new air carrier airport, the first new air carrier airport built in the United States in over 9 years. And very much needed because it's right in the heart of the Bakken. We've had incredible energy development there. We now produce, between 1.2 and 1.3 million barrels a day, second only to Texas. So we have a lot of people coming in, a lot of infrastructure being developed, and obviously air service is incredibly important. And I can't thank the FAA enough for recognizing that we not only needed an expansion of airport facilities, but that we needed to build a whole new airport because they were closed in by the community of Williston. So again, this is the first new air carrier airport built in the United States in over 9 years, and it really is tremendous. And it's not just about serving Williston, it's about serving all of northwest North Dakota as well as parts of eastern Montana and a very important growing energy industry area for our nation. So that shows the importance of the kind of provisions that we have in this legislation and how it affects every part of our great nation. Ensuring long-term certainty for FAA programs like the Airport Improvement Program are essential for our airport construction projects, as I've described, in the Williston Basin. And it's particularly important that we have this funding and that we're able to utilize it in an efficient way. For example, in cold weather states like my state or the state of our presiding officer, you have a relatively short construction season. And so you got to get out there and get after it and get it done when you can. And that's what we're doing with this legislation, as well as our appropriation bill, making sure the funding's there, but that we can deploy it cost effectively and in a way where we get that the funding out there to get the construction done when we can actually do it. Further, the FAA reauthorization includes a number of provisions that I worked on and authored to expand upon work that we're doing in North Dakota on unmanned aerial systems. So this is a big part of the future of aviation. And I want to thank the Commerce Committee Chairman, Commerce Committee being the Committee of Jurisdiction. So I'd like to thank Chairman Thune, my good buddy from the other Dakota, and also the ranking member for their work on the UAS legislation with me that we've included in this bill. As my colleagues well know, North Dakota is one of the leading states when it comes to development of unmanned aviation systems technology. As a matter of fact, one of the leading, and eastern North Dakota has even been referred to as, quote, the Silicon Valley for drones, quote, by one of the prominent media outlets. Our Northern Plains Unmanned Aircraft Systems Test Site in Grand Forks, North Dakota, is one of 7 UAS research and development sites in the nation, providing the proving grounds for a range of from UAS testing, from one pilot operations, and precision agriculture to military applications, defense applications, border security, energy industry, just the whole gamut of military, border protection, and commercial agricultural uses for unmanned aviation. For example, one of the golf courses in Grand Forks, the Kings Walk Golf Course, which I think was actually designed by Arnold Palmer, so it's a very nice golf course, has begun delivering food to golfers on the golf course using drones. So that's pretty cool, and it's a sign of things to come, right? We have companies there like General Atomics, Northrop Grumman, leading aerospace companies that are developing these military applications, whether it's Predator, Reaper, Global Hawk, all these things. So you've got all these ISR, military applications, and so forth. We've got CBP there, Customs and Border Protection. So we have 900 miles of border responsibility. They're using unmanned drones on the border. And I want to assure the presiding officer that's not just to keep an eye on Alaska, but but we work with our good friends in Canada. So Customs and Border Protection, military applications, but then all these other ag and energy applications, but then also this idea of small product delivery, where you can actually have products delivered to your home, right, with drones, and they're actually starting that on the golf course. I mean, you walk before you run. So here you are on the golf course, you're getting, food or beverages delivered to you. That's, first step in this process. And I look at these young people and, I think about what we all carry now is, our smartphones that are amazing computers that can do so much. 10 years ago, or certainly obviously when we were their age, never even dreamed of something like this. Even 10 years ago, I had no idea what this device could do. Think what unmanned aviation system, drones, if you will, are going to do in 10 years, right? You all look at these pages here. They'll be developing these applications. We'll be trying to keep up. The guys like me and the presiding officer, we'll be trying to keep up with these young people. But it's going to be amazing, and we have no idea all the amazing things and applications that are going to be developed. And that's why we've worked so hard in this area, and that's why I'm pleased. I actually, back in 2011, worked on the legislation and authored a lot of it that set up the test sites that we have. And we were actually the first test site named. And what we've been able to include in this bill is another 5-year extension of those test sites. And that's really important because the work we're doing out there, as I mentioned, some of the great companies we have, they have to know that they're going to be able to continue to operate on those test sites. And we have a lot of special things that go into making sure that they have the airspace so that they can fly these unmanned aircraft and do the testing and the development, whether it's high level, like I described for something like Global Hawk, which is a very large jet aircraft, all the way down to these small drones that are delivering food products on the golf course, right? We got to do it all. And having those test sites is a huge, huge part of it. So another part of it is a second aspect of the legislation that I was able to include in this bill really goes to spectrum. We actually have a program in there that allows us to help develop the spectrum, and that's very important as well. The amendment I offered will enable us to evaluate the best and the safest spectrum for UAS use. And of course, you need that for command and control, right? And so it's amazing the things we have to figure out. Privacy, safety, how we do the command and control, high level, satellite, low level, is that communication towers, what, like cell towers, what spectrums do we use? All these things, redundancy, sense and avoid, all those things go into developing concurrent airspace use for manned and unmanned aircraft, right? So another thing that we included in here is this language that will allow us to evaluate the best and safest spectrum for UAS use. And it's important to ensure that UAS operate on spectrum that provides the safest command and control of the aircraft and involves the least interference with other spectrum users. And so again, I want to thank Chairman Thune for working with me to include this provision in the final bill that enables us to move forward in that very, very important area. As we see growth in UAS development and use, it's also important that we plan for ways to address vulnerabilities. In the wrong hands, unmanned aerial systems can pose a very serious threat to our country, to people, to property. And so I was also pleased that this legislation includes the Preventing Emerging Threats Act legislation that I helped introduce, along with the chairman of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. I'm also on that committee, and worked with Chairman Ron Johnson on that. And I really appreciate his work, but certainly the fact that we were able to include this in that legislation, which Secretary Nielsen at DHS very much wants. I mean, she was very clear. Department of Homeland Security needs this legislation to have the authorities not only to protect our nation's borders, but internally as well, in case there would be any kind of unmanned aircraft attack on a facility, and that they have to be able to protect and prevent that. They needed this DHS needed this authorizing legislation to be able to do that. So our bill will help protect important facilities from the security risks posed by anyone using unmanned aircraft improperly or dangerously. So we do this by providing the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice with the authority to protect covered facilities and assets when there is a security risk posed by unmanned aircraft. So I'm pleased we were able to work in all of these areas and include them in this large, important bill. I mean, these are all different areas of aviation that are so important to address for our nation, and our nation leads the world in aviation. We lead the world in aviation. We always have. We lead in technology development, whether it's manned or unmanned aircraft. We're pushing the boundaries, whether it's rocketry or anything else. The president now is advocating a space force. Again, we are pushing the boundaries of aviation. We will continue to do that because of the innovation and the creativity and the ingenuity, the adventurous spirit of the American people. But we've got to make sure our job here in this body and our fellow members of Congress, our responsibility is to make sure we create the framework for our great companies, our great inventors, our great scientists, for these amazing young people with all their brilliant and bright ideas to have that forum, that opportunity, right, that support the legal, tax, and regulatory environment where they can go out and truly do great things where the sky's the limit, right, guys, where the sky is the limit. And that's what this bill is about. It's not government doing it. It's about empowering the great people of this country to do all those great things and continue to lead the world forward with aviation. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
There's a lot going on in the world right now, and a lot obviously in Washington, D.C. But I do want to be able to take a quick global look at some of the things that are happening in trade. But I want to begin by mentioning what's happening in Indonesia. It's a part of the world that a lot of Americans don't travel too often. It's not in our typical sphere to be able to interact with. But right now, the people of Indonesia are digging out from a massive earthquake and tsunami that followed it. The latest death toll numbers are over 1,400 people that they've identified right now. And many of the most remote villages that were deeply affected by the earthquake have not even been reached yet. We don't know how high this death toll is going to climb to. Our State Department is already engaged, as we should, to be able to help them in any way that we can. We've already released some initial aid relief to them. We're already offering our help in any way that we possibly can to be able to assist the people there as they try to be able to make sense of how to be able to go forward on relief efforts. There are private organizations like World Relief or Baptist Global Response that are already on the ground that are engaging to be able to help. There are Americans helping the people of Indonesia, as rightfully so that we should. We should keep our focus on what's happening around the world, and where we can help, we should help and engage. So we continue to be able to pray for and to be able to reach out in practical ways and be able to help the people of Indonesia. And we'll try to keep people updated on that in the days ahead of how people can stay engaged. The president made an announcement earlier this week dealing with international activities with closer neighbors in Indonesia, though, with Canada and with Mexico. This is an issue that's been discussed for quite a while. The president brought up in his campaign and immediately went to work on trying to be able to reshape the NAFTA agreement. Now, what's interesting is different states have different opinions about NAFTA. But in Oklahoma, our number 1 and number 2 largest export locations are Canada and Mexico. Our manufactured products, our agricultural products are moving north and south often to our close neighbors. And NAFTA's been a win for us as far as building our own economy and reaching out to our export products on that. So I was very attentive on this. When the president said he wanted to revisit NAFTA, our team quickly engaged with the president, with his team, to be able to talk about what can we do to be able to help. It was one of the issues that I brought up with Robert Lighthizer before he was even appointed to the position he's in as United States Trade Representative. We talked about NAFTA. We talked about the importance of trade agreements to make sure it was well. I met with Greg Dowd, the chief agricultural negotiator, multiple times through the process on this. I've met with the White House to be able to talk numerous times. Met with the president himself, met with the vice president, met with different individuals with their team to be able to talk about how important the trade is and how essential it is that we get to a good deal. Initially, the focus was on we're going to just resolve it with Mexico and leave Canada out. My conversations with the White House are, I understand pressure on Canada, but Oklahoma's number one trading partner is Canada. So I'd encourage you to be able to finish this out as well, because it's also exceptionally important to us. There is this perception that only the people that border with Canada care about trade with Canada. That's not so. So we continue to be able to interact with them in letters, in meetings, in phone calls, and was pleased to be able to see a trade agreement that actually came forward this week. There's a lot to still be resolved, and we're still going through the details on it. But the important thing to be able to come through it is locking in some of the things that we already had with trade agreements. Because when I speak to the people in my state about trade, they will often say, we want to resolve the trade issues with our friends, but the main focus we want to have is reach out to make new friends internationally. Let's resolve the markets that we already have and make sure that's stable, but let's try to find new places to be able to sell our products and establish new trade agreements. It makes sense for our economy. It makes sense, quite frankly, worldwide for us. So I was pleased to be able to see the administration step forward in saying we're resolving the issues with Canada and Mexico and resolving some of the unanswered issues. If you go back to the 1990s, we weren't talking a lot about e-commerce in the 1990s when the NAFTA deal was first done. It was time for an update on that. It was time, quite frankly, for a state like ours that deals with a lot of wheat, that Canada finally acknowledges the wheat that we grow is quality wheat. Canada had a bad habit of every time we sent quality wheat to them, they would downgrade it as soon as it came across the border, so that American wheat was never the same quality as Canadian wheat. Well, sorry to say, our wheat is that quality, and so that's finally being resolved back and forth with Canada and the United States. Simple things like what is de minimis products to be able to carry across the border between Canada and Mexico might not seem like a big deal, but allowing an individual to be able to travel across the border from the United States to Canada or back and forth with a small amount of goods that they purchased is significant to someone that's just going to be a normal consumer crossing back and forth across the border. To finally get that resolved, that's been a problem for a long time. And the dairy issues famously have been a problem to be able to resolve with Canada. To be able to open up their market a little bit more to dairy products is very significant for us. This preserves and expands access for U.S. poultry and egg producers. It makes updates to the areas where we need modern updates. So I'm pleased to be able to see that we're finally moving in an area to be able to resolve this. Now, there are some areas that I think still are unresolved. This issue about an expiration date, I've spoken with the administration multiple times about. I think trade agreements can be revisited at any moment. We don't have to set an expiration date on it. Clearly, they can be revisited because we're revisiting NAFTA right now to be able to renegotiate the deal. I don't think we need to set some future date in the future and say this whole thing goes away. I think that sets an arbitrary deadline on a trade deal that if it's working, we can renegotiate the areas that need to be tweaked, but leave it in place. It creates greater stability. So I look forward to having the debate about some of those issues and to try to resolve some of those things. But in the meantime, I do want to thank the Trump administration for doing the work that was required, taking on the trade issue that needed to be taken on for quite a while and trying to actually get this resolved. Now that NAFTA is wrapping up, and we look forward to, again, seeing the details in the days ahead and it coming before Congress for a vote as we see all the details and all the American people are able to see this final negotiation. I look forward to seeing the next tier. The next tier are the new markets. We have trade issues, for instance, with Japan and United States beef. The whole world wants to have our beef, and they know the quality of the beef that we put out. But Japan has arbitrary tariffs that well exceed the norms against American beef coming into Japan that other countries don't face. That needs to be resolved with Japan. We need to continue to expand our exports into multiple other countries. The Trans-Pacific Partnership that was discussed in the previous administration, this administration set aside and said we're going to do bilateral negotiations rather than doing multilateral negotiations. I understand that, but it's time to take on those bilateral negotiations. It's time to actually deal with those trade agreements and try to expand into new markets and into new places. As the American economy is thriving right now, we're continuing to create greater efficiencies, greater products. The world continues to be able to want our products, and the more we can negotiate those deals and find places to send them and people that want to buy them, let's do it. And I would add one more thing in this. We have a unique relationship with England. As the UK breaks away in their Brexit vote from the EU and from that trading bloc, they're working on negotiating a deal with Europe. we should be aggressively negotiating a deal with the UK to form a trading relationship. There's no reason the United States and the UK shouldn't be the first major trade negotiation that they take on and that we solve. We have a lot of products back and forth, aerospace being one of those prime areas where the UK and the United States should be able to cooperate extensively in aerospace. Let's get that trade agreement going. Let's make sure that we can get that locked in, because in the days ahead, we'll want to continue to have our close ally with the UK, including a close free trade agreement between us to make sure that we can knock down tariffs. This is a moment when the UK can walk away from Europe's high tariffs and high barriers to trade and to actually say, let's establish a closer relationship with our close ally with the UK. There's a lot to be done in trade. There's a lot of new places to go. And there are some areas that I would tweak and do different, even in this new deal on NAFTA with the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement. But I'm proud of the administration that they've actually taken this on to be able to solve it. As I've jokingly said, they've had the ability to be able to break things. Now it was time to be able to prove they can fix some things. This is one they're fixing, and it will be good for the American economy in the days ahead to be able to see if it's done. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, shortly the Senate is going to vote on legislation called the FAA bill. It's the concerns of air travelers across the country. The bill before us has some key safety and security aviation measures. We've worked across the aisle to bring the Congress a 5-year authorization of the Federal Aviation Administration. This is the first 5-year bill of the FAA that has passed and will pass this Congress since the 1980s. And why is that important? There needs to be stability for planning purposes for the aviation industry. And fortunately, this bill is marking a new mark of bipartisanship that would allow us to get such an extensive bill charting the authorization for aviation for the next 5 years. Remember, Mr. President, there was a time that during 1 year we had multiple extensions. And that's been the inability to bring bipartisan agreement to the FAA governing aviation. Well, we have that agreement, and it's going a 5-year bill. I've already commended Chairman John Thune in a hearing this morning on another topic in the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. It is that bipartisanship that brings us to this point. Now, along with the FAA bill, the bill will also provide long-term stability and continued focus on security and safety at the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, and the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. And that's the entity that's charged with determining the cause of aviation and other transportation accidents. This bill greatly benefits the flying public. It ensures the FAA's core mission remains safety, and it helps American aviation and aerospace companies remain competitive and produce good-paying jobs. And in Florida alone, my state, aviation and aerospace companies employ over 98,000 people. It's big time to us in Florida. And most important of all, Mr. President, we have heard of weary travelers loud and clear with their cries for help, and help is on the way. And that's why this bill contains a number of comprehensive consumer protections. We have all experienced the indignity and the frustration of being squeezed into smaller and smaller airline seats. And under this bill, the FAA will be required to establish minimum dimensions for passenger seats. For airline passengers who purchased airline services that were never received, the legislation requires prompt refunds. Remember how infuriating it is if your bag doesn't arrive? What about if it's completely lost? The indignity that you have already paid for that bag, you're going to get a refund. And we've also addressed the needs of the traveling families by requiring early boarding during pregnancy, private space in airports for nursing mothers, ensuring strollers can be checked in at the gate. And oh, by the way, you know how cigarettes are prohibited on flights? Prohibiting e-cigarettes, electronic cigarettes on flights. And the bill calls for the development of a Bill of Rights for passengers with disabilities. We've also established an aviation consumer advocate within the Department of Transportation. The aviation consumer advocate will now be there to help travelers who have been mistreated by the airlines. And those are just some of the consumer-oriented reforms. It will be incumbent on the Trump administration to carry out these improvements. And this Senate will be enacting our constitutional responsibility of oversight to see that the executive branch is doing just that. Now, aside from the consumer wins, I'd also like to mention that the bill advances the TSA's mission of securing our transportation system by expanding the use of bomb-sniffing dogs, speeding up the deployment of technology, and addressing gaps in surface transportation security. The bill also addresses another topic, disaster recovery and response, by including protections for local governments who have experienced a natural disaster by limiting the number of years that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, can demand repayment of disaster assistance in cases that don't involve fraud or abuse. That's a real problem in Florida, where years later they call it a clawback, that FEMA's trying to claw back disaster assistance funds that it had already sent to the state or local governments, and then claim, no, you shouldn't have had that. Years later, of course, those funds have already been spent. It's a very important issue for Florida and so many of our cities and counties that are put in this economic fiscal bind. For the residents of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, there's also an extension of disaster unemployment assistance. And believe you me, after those island territories, our fellow U.S. citizens, have been hit by the hurricanes that roared through last year, that part of the world, there is still a lot of unemployment. And they need that unemployment assistance as a result of the natural disaster that occurred. In the case of Puerto Rico, not just one, but two hurricanes, Irma and Maria, hit and devastated that island. This is certainly going to help for those who lost their jobs or they were unable to work due to Hurricane Maria. get back on their feet. Mr. President, as the ranking member of the Commerce Committee, I've always sought to address the national challenges by reaching across the aisle to find bipartisan consensus. And this bill just does that. And as I said in my comments, Senator Thune has been a great partner to work with. And I appreciate the opportunity of working with him, with Senators Blunt and Cantwell, as well as Representatives Schuster, DeFazio, McCall, and Thompson on this important legislation. 5 years, an FAA bill. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired, and the question occurs on the motion to concur. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy.
And we play the press, a bunch of 20-year-olds. Yeah. That's how
Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mrs. McCaskill.
That's why you lose.
Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Bozeman, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Cornyn, Daines, Duckworth, Enzi, Ernst, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Grassley, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Manchin, Murray, Nelson, Perdue, Peters, Schatz, Smith, Sullivan, Toomey, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Murphy, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso and Markey. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye.
No one can agree. He said some offensive shit about it. He was went home. Sit. Great fun.
Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye.
Oh, really?
Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye.
I'm on duty this week, which means it's not fucking problem. I can go get a school. Hello, Mr. Acosta. When Jimmy used to get dancing around this, I don't think I would mind it being. Yeah.
You get the monitors?
Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye.
No one can, I can breathe, no one gaggle. You're just gonna flew and went through the motion.
Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name. I'm Mary. What is it again? Nicole. Nicole. Are you going to push back a little now that everybody's in? I'm happy to.
Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye.
Mark. Yeah, you're out of town when it was birthday. Oh, sure, sure.
Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye.
Thank you. Yes, you're welcome. I'll get there.
Mr. Byrd. Mr. Byrd, aye. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 93, the nays are 6. The motion to concur is agreed to. The motion to concur having been agreed to, the motion to concur with amendment is rendered moot. As if in legislative session, under the previous order, the chair lays before the Senate the House message with respect to H.R. 6.
Resolved that the House agree to the amendment of the Senate to the bill H.R. 6 entitled An Act to Provide for Opioid Use Disorder Prevention, Recovery, and Treatment, and for other purposes with an amendment.
Madam President.
Senator from South Dakota.
As if in legislative session, I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 6 under the previous orders.
The motion is pending.
Madam President.
Senator from South Dakota.
I have 10 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Madam President, it is oftentimes easy to believe the news reporting on how the Senate is broken and bipartisanship is dead. But then you work with your colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, from the House and the Senate on something like the FAA Reauthorization Act, which we just passed, and you are reminded that we can still come together and get things done for the American people. The bill that we just overwhelmingly passed and sent to the President's desk is the longest FAA reauthorization since the 1980s, and it will improve our aviation system for travelers, manufacturers, and innovators alike. The bill also reauthorizes the Transportation Security Administration, ensuring improved screening technologies and more explosive detection canines, additional focus on security and surface transportation in public areas, and new pathways to mitigate airport security delays for an overall better travel experience. It also reauthorizes the National Transportation Safety Board, providing key reforms to modernize and improve transparency in this important safety agency's investigations, recommendations, and board member discussions. And these important provisions are just the 3/4 of the bill in the jurisdiction of the Senate Commerce Committee, of which I have the privilege to serve as chairman. As chairman, I would like to personally thank the members of our committee for all their hard work this Congress, and especially to Senator Nelson, the committee's ranking member, Senators Blunt and Cantwell, the chairman and ranking member of our Aviation Subcommittee, and Senators Fisher and Peters.
The Senate will be in order.
The chairman and ranking member of our Surface Transportation Subcommittee. I would also like to acknowledge on the House side, Chairman Schuster and ranking member DeFazio of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Chairman McCall and ranking member Thompson of the House Homeland Security Committee, and Chairman Smith and ranking member Johnson of the House Science Committee. They have been great partners, and I appreciate their efforts in helping to get this bill across the finish line. And finally, I would like to thank, Madam President, all the staff from both chambers who worked tirelessly, including many late nights and weekends on this bill. Without their efforts, the final product would not have been such a success. And while everyone on the team worked hard on this bill, on my staff, I would like to especially thank Nick Rossi, Adrian Arnakis, Mike Reynolds, Simone Perez, Jackie Keeshan, Missy Brickell, Fern Gibbons, Jason Smith, Andrew Neely, Isaiah Wannenberg, Chance Costello, Allison Grab, Frederick Hill, and Brianna Manzelli. On Senator Nelson's staff, the thanks should go to Kim Lipsky, Mohsen Saeed, Tom Chapman, Chris Day, Lawrence Wildgoose, and Denny Bloom. And Madam President, I'd also like to place in the record, instead of probably going through the whole list, the names of the staffers of our partner committees in the House who played key roles in the legislation. Of course, Chairman Schuster's staff, who chairs the T&I committee in the House, which was very instrumental in getting this bill across the floor in the House and ultimately over to us here in the Senate. And then also the ranking member, as I mentioned, Peter DeFazio's staff. Would ask unanimous consent to be able to include their names in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Also, Chairman McCall's staff and then ranking member Thompson's staff as well. From Chairman Smith's staff, who chairs the House Science Committee, and there was a good amount of science policy that was ultimately included in this legislation. And also, as I said, ranking member Johnson's staff. Those individuals we're very grateful, and I will include their names in the record. But I'm sure there will be people, Madam President, who I have left off this list, and I apologize for that. But it just underscores the amount of collective effort that underpins our work here. And I could also easily expand that list to include those at the Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration, who provided valuable assistance and technical expertise. But we look forward now that this is passed and will be headed to the President's desk for his signature to working with them on its implementation. So again, Madam President, I just want to say thank you to my colleagues who supported this bill and all those who were involved in bringing us to a conclusion here. This is the culmination of many months of hard work, bipartisan negotiation, and frankly, it wasn't easy, and that's a great credit to the staff members that I mentioned and to the individual members of our committee and the other committees who were so involved in seeing this get across the finish line. So I say that thanks to the members here on the floor and to the members of our committee. And Madam President, with that, I would yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I'd like to extend my congratulations to the senator from South Dakota. This is a significant achievement on which he and Senator Nelson and others have worked very hard. I want to especially thank him for including in the bill something that Senator Feinstein of California and I have worked on for several years, and that is a provision to ban the use of cell phones on airplanes. I mean, there's nothing worse than sitting next to someone on a 4-hour flight who would make it his or her business of revealing all their intimate details of their life to someone on a cell phone, and this would take care of that. Sometimes, and I would say to the senator from South Dakota, sometimes I suggest to my friends in Tennessee that they look at Washington, D.C. as a split-screen television. On the one side are tweets and Supreme Court contention and cable television and arguments, and on the other side, we're getting quite a bit done, like the FFA bill, like the Songwriters bill, like the appropriations bills that have kept us first in the world in supercomputing, and thanks to the leadership of Senator Blunt of Missouri and Senator Murray of Washington, have for the 4th consecutive year included record funding for biomedical research. That doesn't capture as much attention as the other side of the TV screen, but it demonstrates that we're capable in this body both of vigorous contention on arguments, and we're also capable of doing the basic work of the Senate, which is to take big issues, see if we can come to some agreement about it, and come to a lasting conclusion, which the senator was able to do, and I congratulate him for it. I want to speak for a few minutes about another example of that. for we are in the midst of a contentious disagreement about the Supreme Court. But at the same time, we have an urgent bipartisan consensus, a virtually unanimous agreement to deal with the most urgent public health epidemic facing our country today in virtually every community, and that is the opioids crisis. Each one of us has stories about how the opioids epidemic is ravaging our hometowns and our home states. For example, at one of the several hearings we had in the Health Committee, which I chair, a mother, Becky Savage, talked about her two sons, who she found in her basement after a graduation party one night, both dead. She was happy that they were in their basement because instead of out driving around town doing what teenagers might be doing, they were at home. But someone brought alcohol, someone brought opioids pills from a medicine cabinet in some home, and someone mixed those two together, producing 2 overdoses for 2 children who were not drug addicts, who were not alcoholics, but who made a mistake. Or visiting the Niswonger Children's Hospital in Johnson City, Tennessee, where a third of the babies born in the neonatal center there are born withdrawing from opioids because their mothers are addicted. And it takes them days or weeks more to get over that. Or listening to the 2 judges in Upper East Tennessee, 2 criminal court judges, state judges, who said that of 6,000 completed cases that they heard last year, 2/3 of them had something to do with the opioids epidemic. Or the drug agent from Tennessee who was in my office, who deals with meth, all sorts of drugs, who told me, described for me what had happened when in Dixon County they captured some fentanyl. Fentanyl is the white powder that's 50 times stronger than opioids, which comes from China often in the mail, and which this bill that we're about to talk about deals with. But this drug agent, who is an experienced law enforcement officer, told me that just by opening a small plastic bag with a few of the white powders getting into the air, he was almost overcome and had to leave the room because it would cause him to pass out. That's the epidemic that we're dealing with everywhere in America. Before I describe the bill, let me talk about 2 things that have to do with the bill. One is money and one is moonshot. People often say when I describe our bill, which we call the Opioid Crisis Act, but it's now called, and I think a better name, the Support for Patients and Communities Act. When I describe the bill, people say, where's the money? Well, the money's not in this bill. This is an authorization bill. We do money in other bills. We call them appropriations bills. And the Congress and President Trump have both been attentive to the money since just March, including the appropriations bill passed in March and the appropriations bills approved by the Senate last week. We will have directed in the Congress $8.5 billion toward the opioid crisis. Everything from hundreds of millions for non-addictive pain medicines to $1 billion for grants to states for more treatment. $8.5 billion just this year. That's the money. And then so far as the moonshot, some people say to me, well, we need a moonshot for the opioids, and I wish we could have one. We probably need the energy. We probably need the money. We probably need the resources and determination that it took in the 1960s for President Kennedy to say, let's go to the moon in a decade. But unfortunately, we can't do that from Washington, D.C. This problem won't solve itself from here. We can't assign this task to an agency and say, fix it in 10 years. That's why we call this bill the Support for Patients and Communities Act. The opioids epidemic is going to have to be solved in Ames, Iowa, and Nashville, Tennessee, and Sacramento, California, and communities all across this country by governors who work with medical faculty to change the curriculum about how doctors learn about pain medicine, to states who, like Tennessee, have begun to limit the opioid prescriptions to 3 days at a time to try to avoid the 60-pill bottle
that someone might take home and use 15 pills and then have the rest taken by a teenager to a party with a terrible result at the end, to the judges who deal with opioids in their criminal cases, to the nurses and the treatment officials who try to help people with medication. All of this has to be solved community by community by community. We know that. We're not pretending that a single act here can fix the problem. But we do know, and that's why we have had an urgent bipartisan consensus on this. Contributions from 5 Senate committees, 72 different senators are reflected in this bill. That's why we have an urgent bipartisan consensus, because we want to do everything we can do to provide tools to parents and patients and doctors and nurses and communities and governors, anyone we can find to deal with this crisis. Senator McConnell has called this opioids legislation landmark legislation, and I believe he is right. In our state, as in most states, more people are killed by opioid overdoses than by car crashes. 1,776 in Tennessee last year. That's why the House passed this bill by 393 to 8 last Friday. That's why after today, when we vote on this bill at 3:15, it will go directly to the president, and I'm confident he will sign it quickly. With more than 70 different provisions, there's no way to talk about them all. They're each one important, but here are a few of the most important. Senator Portman's STOP Act. I talked about fentanyl, that white powder, 50 times more powerful.
So channel 1. Channel 2 is the podium. Help them out. Come on. You don't need help.
I need all the help I can get. Thank you. You got that right.